Big prisons are extending their reach beyond jail cells to make more money off incarcerated people. The number of people incarcerated is going down in the United States, but more inmates means more money, and private prisons are looking to make a profit by providing their own services with almost no oversight by the government.
The most common ways these prisons make money is by charging inmates for phone calls, contracting medical services and food services, transporting prisoners, and charging inmates for basic needs. Earlier, I spoke to Axios reporter Stef Kight about where this trend started and what it means for prisoners.
It all started with the war on drugs when the U.S. started incarcerating increasing numbers of people. And of course, the U.S. still, even with the decline over the past few years, is the most incarcerated nation in the world. And so we really saw a lot of these big companies, these big prison companies, boom alongside the war on drugs. They rose along with the rising incarceration rates in the U.S. And that's where they got their money. As you said, the more people who are in prison, the more spaces are needed, the more services are needed. And while most people are aware of the for-profit prison industry, sometimes they don't realize all of the services that also create profits for companies, like, as you mentioned, phone calls for prisoners, which oftentimes are really expensive, and food services and health care, and even just the everyday toiletries that family members or prisoners would buy from the commissaries, and that also drives a lot of profit. And of course, when you look at the companies that provide those services, that provide, clothes and toiletries and these other small items that prisoners can buy, they're not necessarily marking up those prices, but prisoners don't really make any money. And of course, you have to take a step back and recognize that not only is the prison system expensive, but it also, we jail the poor people in the U.S. overwhelmingly. The poorest people in our societies are often the ones who are ending up behind bars.
Yeah, Axios really takes a really deep dive into this. You do an excellent job. Wherever there's a lot of money and wherever politics has a role in it, you get lobbyists. So can you talk a little bit about the influence of lobbyists when it comes to this sort of stuff?
Absolutely. Two of the biggest for-profit companies, GEO Group and CoreCivic, they do spend millions of dollars. Over the past 2 years, they've spent millions of dollars on lobbying efforts. And when I spoke to their spokespeople, they assure us that, they don't lobby to incarcerate more people, but they do lobby for things like reentry programs. And they say they do lobby to explain how their businesses work. Of course, it's interesting to look at, as we've seen this bipartisan rise in interest in reentry and reducing recidivism rates, we've also seen these big companies sort of change their offerings. They're not just offering for-profit prisons. Now they're also getting into reentry programs and ankle bracelets, things that you would use for probation and parole. They're also becoming really large in the immigrant detention industry. Most of the immigrants in detention are being held in for-profit detention centers. So as we're seeing the fall in incarceration rates, that's not the only way that these companies make money.
And there's also been a lot of pushback very, very recently in regards to the bail system, and you guys talk about that as well.
Yeah, the bail system is one of the first ways that the U.S. prison system ends up hurting the most impoverished in our communities. Oftentimes, people are put in jail before they've been convicted of a crime, and they stay there because they can't afford bail. Even if it's not a ton of money, if they don't have a couple extra $100 or a couple extra $1,000, then they're not able to post that bail and get out of jail until their court date. And we're seeing over half of the people behind bars are in our jails are there because they can't afford bail, or for some other reason why they can't get out and they haven't been convicted yet. But there have been movements across the nation to end cash bail because it tends to hurt people who just don't have the cash. It's not keeping people behind bars because they might not show up to court or that they've been charged with a serious crime. It's just because they don't have the extra cash to pay, which forces them to either turn to the bail bond system where they can pay a fee and have someone else cover their bail, or oftentimes these people will plead guilty whether or not they are guilty because they can get out on time served or be placed on probation, and at least that way they're not behind bars. They have a better chance of keeping their job and caring for their loved ones.
So I remember reading that shortly after President Trump was elected, there was sort of a spike for private prison companies. There was a spike on Wall Street for them, right? Their stocks went up. But we know that there have been some tweaks in the laws, right? The criminal justice reform sort of legislation that the Trump administration passed, the decriminalization of marijuana and sort of various other drugs that we're seeing a wave across the country. Is that having an impact on the number of people we incarcerate, and how is this sector pushing back or at least responding to it?
Well, one of the reasons we saw stocks rise was because President Obama made some efforts to limit the use of for-profit prisons. And when President Trump came into office, he did away with the efforts that Obama was making. So that's one reason. It was kind of a removal of some of the efforts from the previous administration to curtail the use of for-profit prisons. And another impact is if you look at spending from ICE, federal spending from the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, has risen pretty significantly over the past few years to these for-profit prison companies. And so the rise in immigrants who are in detention centers has also helped boost these companies. And I do think they're obviously, they are a big part of our system. And there was a sense where the government needed these companies at a certain time. They did not have the capacity to hold the number of people that were being incarcerated in the 80s and 90s, and now they're struggling to hold the number of immigrants in detention. So there is a sense in which, sure, the government relies on these companies to provide services, but what most advocates who I've spoken to, most criminal justice reform advocates I've spoken to have said is that they just want more oversight into these companies, more regulation with these companies to ensure the safety of prisoners and migrants in their care.
All really interesting. So many things to sort of touch on when you start to talk about this topic. Stef Kight, thank you very much.
Thank you.